Intro into it as to why I'm doing it, because I've been to lots of lectures and the guy that comes on and he goes blah 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 blah, all very entertaining, but you know nothing about this guy. Yeah? So what I want to do, and because I like interviewing, and it'll be a lot more gentle than the interview with Larry, fortunately, it'll be more laid back a la Michael Parkinson, if I can dare say that. Yeah? But I want to give you a flavour of somebody who happens to get caught up in a world famous event. And there is no two ways about it, it's a world famous event. Right, so everybody upstairs, oh my God, we've got people sat down from everywhere. Where they come from? We've got people standing up. Oh, they all want to see Travis. Well, it's what you've paid your money to see. Now, first of all, I'm going to hand the microphone. We're obviously going to sit there, me and Travis, but to introduce this section is going to be Larry Warren.
Just when you thought you had enough. Go back there now. I want to thank you all for that. I was absolutely blown away, and really, it's a nice time to get something. I've never had anything like that, and thanks. It's all you. And love to the Scousers in the house. Give a shout. Anyway, this is a different format. I've worked with Gary for now 4 years as his Ed McMahon to his Johnny Carson, when he lets me. And it's an honor to do. It's a family thing. I see just a lot of great friends here and new friends. And there's a young man here of 15. And if my son was here, you could both text and grunt at each other, but that's what they do. But our host, Gary Heseltine, is, and I always get his name wrong on purpose, by the way. We know him. He was a British Transport Police detective. He was involved in the 7/7 bombings in London as far as investigating and many other probably horrific things that law enforcement have to do on a day-to-day basis. He turned his attention to this subject. He was mentored, in his view, by the late Graham Birdsall, who I spoke for many times, who ran the biggest thing in England in its day. When Graham passed, I said, this subject's going on the ground with him in this country. Well, thank God, this man I'm going to introduce first and bring to his chair, resurrected, in my view. Give me a hand if you think so. We're heading back, and Graham, I think, be quite proud of Mr. Gary. What do you think, folks? We need a focal point. We don't need internet nonsense and crap. We need a focal point. This man's giving it to us. Gary, will you take your seat, please, sir? Well I'm going to do trial. Okay. Well, don't come out until, well, you ruined it. If I was Ed Sullivan, Jackie Mason did that and he never worked again, I'd roll. But I want to introduce this next guy, too, who's right here, surprisingly. And my mic is working. In 1975, in November, I was laying on the floor watching Walter Cronkite on CBS Evening News. And I liked news as a teenager. And there was a helicopter flying over the Mogollon Rim in a search party, and it was national news in my country about this logger who they suspected maybe his work crew had killed and disposed of his body. And I was fascinated. I ran out and got his book the next year, The Walton Experience, I believe, and I never dreamed in my wildest life I would be on a stage with him. But one quick aside, because it's about this guy. Many years later, when I became the dancing monkey of Rendlesham or Bentwaters, I was on a home box office show called UFO's What's Going On. They used and played with an interview with me. You probably see a lot of that in the internet now. And I said, I'm calling that guy, because he was on it. They said, Travis Walton, now 29, remember them days? And I get on, and I actually, if I believe this is correct, Travis's wife at the time answered the phone. I said, this was the first day he turned his phone back on, trying to hide from people like me. And I was the call that came in. And through the years, the many years since then, I have had the honor to call him a friend and work with him. In my view, as an American, he is an American hero for a million reasons. He has passed every kind of test, both of heart, soul, and anything looked at in a courtroom. It's an honor to introduce my good friend and my personal hero too, Mr. Travis Walton. Welcome to England.
Thank you very much, Larry. Okay. I think he's a bit nervous by this, and I keep saying there's nothing to worry about. But you can see he looks a bit pensive, right? The great Travis Walton. Okay, you've all paid your money to see all the guests and speakers, but I guess a lot of you were drawn, like I was many years ago, to a very famous incident that occurred in 1975 involving a young Travis Walton. And like I said in the introduction, this is not so much to go into the fine detail of that incident, because he will probably do that in his own lecture tomorrow. But this is something I want to do, one, because I enjoy it, but I think that you will enjoy it too. Albeit don't shout out now, tell me later. All right, so Travis, thank you very much for, first of all, coming to little old Holmfirth in West Yorkshire. A round of applause from the audience again. Thank you. And like I said, I want to kind of take you through your life a little bit. So let's start at the start. Where were you born?
When was I born?
Where were you born?
Yeah, I was born, and it was in 1953
Okay, and where was that?
in Phoenix, Arizona.
Okay, and in terms of the place where you grew up, what kind of community was that?
Well, you know, I lived in a very suburban neighborhood, right in the middle of Phoenix. But it wasn't very long before we moved from there on my journey to my ultimate destiny in Snowflake, Arizona, with a few years living in Payson on the way, which is you know, a community that was in the edge of the forest, at the foot of the Mogollon Rim. Which is sort of a geological feature across northern Arizona there. It's like a cliff. It's the edge of the Colorado Plateau. And, you know, the Sitgreaves National Forest is the largest ponderosa pine forest in the world. I have to mention that because a lot of people think of Arizona as being a large desert.
Okay, and if you were to categorize the type of community, i.e. the main job in the area, how would you describe that?
Well, when we first moved into Snowflake, it was an extremely very small community, predominantly Mormon, but very conservative and very rural. Home of the largest pig farm in the United States at the time. And quite a bit cattle industry and logging, forest-related work. And that's what brought us to Snowflake. My mother married a logger, and that's what brought us to Snowflake.
So in terms of, say, the main type of job that people did, was there a particular job that a lot of people did in the area?
Well, there was also the paper mill, which started off being just turning wood chips into paper. Later on, recycling was added to that. But that was the principal employer for quite a while, from early 60s onward until just a few years ago.
Okay, now, just moving it along slightly, we all know that you were, what we would say in England, a lumberjack, a logger. When did you first get into logging?
Well, from the time we moved there, I was employed by my mother's husband in his operations, you know, doing all kinds of different things, running a chainsaw, or I don't know if you know what setting chokers is, but you put a cable around the log and it's hooked to what's called a skidder, which is just a big cat or a rubber-tired tractor that drags the logs up to the landing from where they're loaded there onto the truck.
So how old would you have been when you first started to do that?
That would have been probably about 14, 15 years old.
Okay, so by the time of the incident in 1975, I think you were 22 at the
I
time?
was 22.
Okay, so you're already kind of familiar with the industry for 7, 8 years?
Yeah, I've worked quite a bit in the woods doing other woods-related work, cutting firewood, but also during school, I worked for my best friend there in high school. His father owned a wood molding mill, and so I would work there in weekends and evenings for extra money.
Okay, so let's move to 1975. You've been a logger. Is that the term that you would use in the States?
Well, that's what it's the most easily understood thing. What we were actually doing on that particular contract was called TSA, Timber Stand Improvement, and it had to do not so much with cutting log for timber, but cutting out diseased trees that had mistletoe in them or that had been scraped up by the logging operation that had gone on the year before. So it was really, kind of a tree improvement sort of a project. And the contract was crisscrossed with these bands where we took everything that was cut and cut it into smaller pieces and stacked it in the clearings so that it could be burned when there was snow on the ground. So you would remove the fuel for a forest fire in strips through the forest. And the idea being that this would be a place where a fire might be more easily fought or might even stop of its own because of the reduced fuel.
So on the fateful day, however you want to describe it, what kind of day was it?
Well, we were doing fuel reduction strip that day, and we were working they generally tended to follow roads or ridge tops where you could also get vehicles in to fight forest fire. So that's what we were doing that day.
And the crew you were with, how many others were with you?
Well, there was 7 of us all together. And, some of the crew would be cutting the trees, the damaged material, cutting it up into pieces, and then others would be actually piling it in the openings where it could be burned without damaging the other trees.
And in terms of the crew itself, how long had you worked with these kind of people?
Well,
this
some of
specific
them, I had worked with before, but, there was one guy that had only been on the job 3 days. People say your friends, meaning my coworkers, but it wasn't all that congenial of a group. There was a bit of friction here and there, and some fights occurred between me and Alan. Alan would, or Steve would be, taunting the new guy or whatever, I saw a fist fight between Alan and Mike in the street, in the middle of the street in front of my house. So, the idea that we were this close-knit group of buddies who would all conspire to come up with a story to help Mike with his thinning contract is really pretty absurd.
So really, apart from some of the guys who you knew pretty well, this was essentially work colleagues.
Yeah.
You're a work acquaintance, you get on okay, you have to work with them, but they might not be your best.
Yeah, I didn't hang around with most of those guys.
Okay, so of the crew that you were with, who would you say you were closest to?
Oh, probably Mike, the crew boss.
So what's Mike's surname?
It started out that I was good friends with Mike's younger brother, who was not on the crew at that time. And then I became more friends with Mike as time.
Well, what's Mike's surname?
Rogers.
Mike Rogers. And who was in charge of the crew?
Mike Rogers.
And how old was he in relation to the others?
I think he was like 5 years older than I.
So he was the most senior guy, basically? Most experienced?
Yeah, most experienced. He'd been working in the woods for many years, from back when his father was a contractor and he'd worked for his father.
And how would you got to know Mike?
I grew to know Mike by first becoming friends with his brother, who was my age. He went to school in the same class and everything, and I just got to know Mike and became friends.
So in terms of, on the day of the incident, you describe him as the person you were closest to?
At that day, yeah.
Okay. Now, just for some people who may not be aware of where it was, can you tell me in which forest it was in?
The Sitgrave National Forest. It was
That's an
actually
Apache
Sitgrave
That's right.
National Forest,
Right.
which extends all the way from the Grand Canyon clear across into New Mexico. If you understand Southwest U.S. geography.
So, in terms of, you said Snowflake, how far was Snowflake away from where you were actually?
It was probably a 45-mile drive every day.
Okay, and one thing that I meant to ask you, what would be the population of Snowflake roughly at that time?
It was a little over 3,000 people.
So, realistically, this is a small, how would you describe that? A town, a village?
Yeah, it was called the town of Snowflake.
Okay, but a small town.
Yeah.
But in terms of the other communities, small places around, how was the size of Snowflake in relation to other little places?
Well, you know, farther to the south, there's the city of Sholo, and it was actually larger, but for some reason they didn't have their own high school. And during my first years at Snowflake, the kids in Sholo were actually bused from there to go to high school in Snowflake. Same thing with the Heber kids. They didn't have their own high school, and they were bused in to attend school in Snowflake.
Okay, now just starting to focus a little bit towards the incident or aspects of it. Prior to the event that occurred to you, had you any interest in UFOs, flying saucers?
Well, you know, it's a rural area, and I think that there's quite a bit more prevalence of this kind of activity in remote areas for some reason. There was
But you were aware of that prior to the incident, that there had been kind of sightings in those areas?
Yeah, but at the same time, you know, it was still a topic, oh, come on, kind of a thing, you know. But the activity bus was taking a group of football players home after practice, driving from Snowflake to Heber, and they encountered a large glowing object there near the road. They stopped, got out, and looked at it, and that was quite a major sighting. I've never been able to talk to anybody about that except the school bus driver. He actually came to a UFO conference I was at and described that incident. But I would have been really interested to say, all these football players, and they never came forward when my incident happened, you know.
So had you read any kind of UFO literature books, magazines?
No, I'd never read any UFO books or attended any UFO conferences or subscribed to any UFO magazines. I did have a brother that had had a sighting some years before, and
Is this Dwayne?
yes, Dwayne, and it was a daylight sighting. I believed him, but it never became any kind of a hobby or a focus of mine.
Okay, so prior to the incident occurring, had you ever spoken about the subject with your fellow crew members?
Yeah, the subject came up because there was an article in the paper about some cattle mutilations that had occurred in the neighboring county, and I guess some in Navajo County, because Sheriff Gillespie said in an interview that he had been investigating those incidents himself prior to our incident.
Okay, all right, so let's just move. Now, obviously you're going to be doing your main presentation tomorrow.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to touch too deeply on it in terms of the actual incident, because I guess we'll probably go through that. But I want to kind of talk about after the incident. A lot of people will be aware of what's happened, and to summarise, you saw something, you got out of a truck, basically you were hit by a light, the others panicked, fled, left you, thinking you were dead, and basically they then go back, you're not there, and you turn out missing for 5 days, but in that interim time, they told the police and suspicion fell on your crew members. Is that a brief summary?
Yeah, and you know, of course, this whole period of time that they were suspected of murdering me. At the same time, the community was aware of what they had reported, and I'm sure it was very frightening to them, and just eager, grasping at straws, any excuse to justify a belief that, well, this didn't happen, they murdered him. And so I think a lot of people preferred that explanation because it was less frightening than what actually happened.
Now, we kind of all know that your experience was turned into a Hollywood film.
Yes.
And I think we discussed this yesterday about some insights into the film. And I remember when I first met you in Laughlin, Nevada in 2010. We just had a brief conversation. And I kind of asked you this question, which I asked you yesterday, but I think the audience may find it fascinating, which was basically, you got caught up in something and what effect this had on your life afterwards. I know that's a very, very big question, but in your own words, if you had to describe what you went through then and now, could you do that?
Well, you know, initially it was quite a bit different than it's become over time. At that time, it was just devastating in terms of, you know, I'm never going to be able to return to a normal life. The way I was regarded was, you know, people coming up with just every possible alternative explanation that they could possibly imagine to try to explain it away as something other than what it was, because that was the most frightening alternative to them. Everything that you could possibly accuse somebody of, they came up with. So, but initially I just withdrew from the whole thing. I just, you know, didn't know what to do. My main reaction was to just withdraw from the community, refuse to do any interviews, and the media started saying, well, Travis has refused to speak to the media, so that cast doubt on his story. So that wasn't what motivated me to finally come out. It was things that were being said that were so ridiculous that it was just a moment's thought. It could have easily pointed in the direction and say, hey, look over here, this is disproof of this ridiculous allegation. So I was sort of dragged into it. I realized that I could hide from the media, but that's not going to make the story go away. They're still going to do the story, but if I don't participate, it's only, their only sources are the people who are trying to explain it away and all the negative comments. So I started doing interviews to set the record straight. And it wasn't that hard. I mean, if they would at least give me a chance. Very often I would find out something was published and they never even bothered to try to interview me. I could have told them, no, it wasn't that, you know. For example, that it was a transitory psychosis. I temporarily became insane, and because I was crazy, temporarily I went back to normal, everything looked normal, but this would explain why I would pass a lie detector test, but because I believed it happened, but it didn't really happen. But what should have been obvious from the get-go is that 7 people are not going to share my insanity. You know, all the little psychological analysis that was supposed to, you know, in my history, point to why I would have this sudden breakdown didn't apply to the other 6 men. And no matter what the case, you know, 7 people are not going to have an identical hallucination, and never mind the physical evidence.
So in 1993, the film is released, Fire in the Sky, and the question from yesterday, going back to it, is really about how accurate was the film, the Hollywood film, in relation to your story. And I remember you saying to me, the bits on the ground were pretty good, but the bits in the spaceship weren't. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, and you know, I can understand Hollywood. They're not out there to record history or anything. They weren't in the business of making a documentary. They wanted to sell movie tickets, and when the head of the studio, Brandon Tartikoff, heard about a TV miniseries that depicted similar beings, he said, we're going to pull the plug on this movie, and it was already, had quite a bit of momentum at that point, if you don't change the part aboard the craft. So unbeknownst to me, they began writing a whole new scenario for what happened aboard the craft. And I was not informed of this. I got blamed for it, but when I was handed a copy of the script, that sequence was omitted from that. And they said, oh, that's still in development. So I found out what they'd done, and it was basically almost nothing resembling what actually happened. That was a huge disappointment. Some of the other men on the crew were angry about it, and a lot of people who, were, because see, this was in the 90s when this happened, so it had been in like 15 years that it had been discussed in the UFO community for some time. So many of those people were angry and held me responsible for the fictionalization, and I certainly never approved that. But they think, well, it's your story, you should have had the right to veto it, but you don't. When you sign to allow a movie be made into a story, into a movie, they're not going to put you in the driver's seat. They're investing millions of dollars, and it doesn't matter who you are. Some of the top names in the business, Michael Crichton, Stephen King, these guys have had major battles with the movie studios when their books get made into movies because of the kind of changes that they're trying to make to this author's story. And they didn't have the power to stop it, because no matter who you are, they're not going to put you in the driver's seat of their multi-million-dollar investment.
So when was the very first time you saw the finished film?
I went to a private screening on Paramount Studio property with some of the actors and stuff. And it was a powerful experience for me in spite of the fictionalizations, because it recalled for me here more than 15 years later that just all of the things that had gone on in my life, to just be hit with sort of revisiting all of those all at one time. It was a powerful emotional experience for me, seeing that. And it did serve a positive purpose in spite of the fact that they departed from reality. And as time went on, I realized that, I gave the example of Michael Crichton and Stephen King. Those are fictional writers, but other kinds of stories like Gorillas in the Mist or the Bruce Lee story, if you know the story behind the movie, you know how much liberty Hollywood takes with real life stories to make it fit into the traditional Hollywood treatment of things. There's a sort of a basic structure to movies that are probably pretty universal, no matter how varied you might think these movies are. It really has a certain internal structure that's very similar. There's a first act, a second act, a third act, and how things fit into where the climax of events going. So they'll even use flashbacks in order to rearrange things in time so that you see it in the order that they want them to occur in the movie. And so some of the fictionalizations I came to accept as, it comes with the territory as far as making a movie is concerned. Some of it just has to do with making it clearer and easier to understand for audiences. Two of my brothers, Don and Dwayne, became one character named Dan in the movie. To have two brothers who were angry at the crew and suspicious of what they might have done and all that sort of thing, was just that many more characters to follow for the same effect that they were getting at, that my family cared and was very concerned and suspicious of the crew's motive in telling the story.
Do Does that make you angry that they distorted it that much?
There was a certain amount of frustration and disappointment that they didn't stick to how it really happened. But, you know, overall, all in all, the net effect was more positive than negative, in spite of those fictionalizations, because it put people through an emotional roller coaster similar to what we actually endured. And the part aboard the craft, if you want to learn about, you know, the factual matter of UFOs and the phenomena, that's not the source for it, but it certainly did generate in the viewer the experience of the incredible level of fear that I went through. There were some people that thought, well, I wouldn't be that scared. I would just stay calm and ask intelligent questions and maybe pocket a souvenir or something like that. They don't really understand, you know, the circumstances under which I regained consciousness. I came to on the table and with these beings standing around me, but the thing that generated so much fear was not just seeing alien creatures so close. It was the feeling that I was mortally wounded, that something was very wrong inside. And on top of that, above all, was the feeling of suffocation. Now, whether that was a side effect of me being hit by that energy that injured my lungs or my nervous system in a way that interfered with breathing, whatever it was, I had the feeling of suffocation. And so there's a scene in the movie where the actor is covered with a membrane and he's struggling to breathe through it, trying to scream through it. And there was no membrane in what actually happened, but if you were just having an actor breathing hard and looking panicked, you wouldn't understand the feeling of suffocation. So I think it did a better job of putting the viewer through the experience of where does this incredible out of control panic come from. And so that's the one little piece about what happened aboard the craft that I can you know, consider to actually be better than relating exactly what happened. But as far as the overall picture of what happened aboard the craft, it was quite the opposite of what it actually was. The beings were not naked. That's part of Hollywood's obsession with making aliens into invading monsters. If they don't wear clothes, then they're more like a beast, and it's more frightening that way. So these naked aliens are living in an organic-looking, hive-looking thing, and it's all cluttered and irregular in shape. And you know that's gives the audience a feeling of a very disorienting environment. It was very claustrophobic because it was dimly lit, because of the feeling of suffocation, because of the smallness of the space in there. But basically the opposite. Very geometric, very clean, very featureless, and not organic or irregular in form at all.
And with regards to the beings themselves, was there any communication between you to them to you?
I think they were trying telepathically, but I think it was failing. It took me decades to figure that out, but I think that the energy of that beam hitting me had a powerful effect on my nervous system that interfered with their ability to use telepathic control. And the brainwave scan that I went through afterwards backs that up. And the excruciating feeling I got from their stare, I think coincides with that. That's not normally what happens when they are communicating telepathically. They do use the stare, but it doesn't give you that squirmy feeling in the head that I got, that it's normally just, a calm and peaceful communication to the people that I interviewed about it.
Okay, thank you. Now, you touched on it earlier. You mentioned lie detector tests. Now, in the UK, the police don't use polygraphs as like in America, where it's widely used by law enforcement. tell me about how many times you were tested on the polygraph and the circumstances, context.
Well, you know, the polygraph began with tests on the crew, the suspicion of murder. But even after they passed, the president of the American Polygraph Association says, although any single test is not 100%, when you have 6 people passing on the same issue, the odds are 1,000,000 to 1 of there being any error in the testing. And contrary to what a lot of people claim, polygraph is a very well-established science. It's been used by law enforcement. You might have heard in the news here recently about Hillary and her email things. Every FBI agent that was involved in that investigation signed a paper to stay completely mum about it and do no leaking to the press. But it was also an agreement to take a polygraph test if any leak occurred to find out who did it. The top researchers in this science of polygraph have run the schools for the FBI, the CIA, the Israeli Knesset. A lot of other governments do use it, and at the highest levels, places where it's crucially important. And it's been validated through university studies, and you know, a lot of scientific research has gone into it.
So how many tests have you been subjected to?
Altogether, everybody involved has passed 16 or 17 tests. I've passed 5 tests from 3 different examiners of the highest qualifications, people with years of law enforcement experience, people doing this as former police officers, interrogation experts, and the last 2 tests I took were done by a firm that does work for the Albuquerque Police Department, the New Mexico State Prisons, and the United States Marshal Service. And this is in New Mexico, where the results are admissible in court. Not every courtroom in America allows it, because the authority of the legal system is very jealously guarded. You know, we are the arbiter of truth by this process, and they don't want to be supplanted by any kind of technological thing that people might interpret as having a competing validity. But I agree that no court case should be decided solely on the basis of a polygraph, but to allow it as one of the factors under consideration by a judge or jury, I think is a perfectly legitimate use of that. And I think a lot of the limitations that have been placed on polygraph in the United States is by Congress, because by definition, they're a bunch of liars. And they don't want being asked to prove that what they're saying is true. So they come up with the Polygraph Act of something.
Okay, now, to the skeptical world, you failed the test. Tell me about it.
Well, there was this game show, and it was just a big farce from the start. And it didn't really air in the States, because by then the show had been canceled there, but it aired in Europe and places. And so a lot of people were misled. They're not aware of the fact that no one who was ever on that show ever won a prize. Everybody was judged to be, quote, lying. And there was a court-recognized expert on polygraph who had already formed a website dedicated to attacking that show before I was ever on it, just on the basis of the bad science that was involved. They were using a discredited method. They had distorted things to the point where they had broken just about every rule of polygraph, besides the fact that a lot of people who were telling the truth were judged to be lying and had filed lawsuit against the show. And I also found out that 3/4 of the people who were brought in to film a show walked out. And forbid them to use the episode, and actually those episodes were never even aired. But I got the opinion of the top experts, other experts in the field about the show and the methods that were employed, and it was just fake polygraph. The quote I use in the book about this examiner is that that website that was formed about the Moment of Truth show was that it was no validity whatsoever. You could get just as reliable results by flipping a coin. But I think it was worse than that, because the guy's job was to prevent his bosses from ever having to pay any prize money. If you judge everybody blind, you don't pay it out. But the main thing was shock and awe. You know, it was one of those scandal type shows where, you know, they're going to say somebody's lying, and then they show the faces of all the people who had believed him. You know, it wasn't all about UFOs. It was like marital fidelity or who stole the money at work or whatever. But it was always designed to be a tabloid style expose sort of a thing, a scandal.
So did the skeptics ever give the full context of that film?
Pardon?
Do the skeptics, when they write about the Travis story, do they ever?
They also sometimes
there?
use that. The same people who would say, oh, well, never mind all these positive polygraph tests, polygraph isn't worth anything. Well, if they find a show like that says I was lying, oh, okay, we'll accept that polygraph, even though the top experts in the world, you know, people who had run the schools for the CIA, the FBI, and the Canadian police, all those experts say, this is totally bogus. Never mind that. These skeptics are very selective in what they want to use or not use.
Now, I don't know if you're prepared to tell the Philip Glass scenario that you told me yesterday with regards to what, in a sense, he tried to do with regards to the orchestra. Are you happy to talk about
one thing? He was attacking the polygraph test, and so what we said is, okay, you don't like the polygraph test that everybody passed? We challenge you to provide new tests. Now, we'll pay for them if we flunk. And you get to, you know, be in on the whole thing, you know, who the examiner is, how the tests are conducted, and you pay for them if we pass. Well, he wiggled and squiggled and finally wound up, you know, backing out of it. But digging into this guy's past, he was
just let me interrupt you. For those people who aren't aware, Philip Glass was a US aviation expert, written several books, and he became one of the arch-skeptical debunkers who got on every TV station, and he was the #1 guy to go to criticise any UFO event. So it's interesting.
So he attacked every UFO case that came along, the more prominent the better. I mean, there was a priest, and he just, you know, attacked the people, not the evidence. And he would just make up stuff and leave things out and just, you know, distort things to make it look like something was said that wasn't said. I give the example of the Socorro police officer who reported a spacecraft taking off and emitting a roar. And then Philip Glass goes and says, well, this guy living nearby never heard any roar, so that's evidence that you're lying. Well, he neglected to mention that the guy he was referring to couldn't hear. So the fact that he didn't hear a roar is kind of irrelevant, but that's one of those little details you like to leave out. But he was not so much an investigator as he claimed, and not scientific at all. He was just a propaganda expert, and he employed every dirty trick in the book. Anytime he searched for some dirt and couldn't find it, never mind that, he's not going to tell you about it. He's only going to amplify the things that he found. He called all the bars in town to see if he could dig up bad stories about me, and when he couldn't, he never even mentions that. You know, he never said they said good things about him. Called all my employers and they say, good guy. But so he's not going to repeat anything good. He's just looking for dirt. And it was pretty nasty how totally dishonest it was. And probably the dirtiest trick of all was to take and offer $10,000 bribe to one of the crewmen to discredit the story, to deny the truth of it. Now, he couldn't get out of this acknowledging that this dirty trick occurred because the message was sent by way of a local law enforcement officer. Deputy Jim Click carried the message to Steve Pierce that he was being offered $10,000 to discredit the incident. Well, Mike Rogers heard about this. They heard that Steve was actually considering taking it. He was tempted to just go ahead and lie about it to get the money. And so Mike said, and here was the quote, "If you would do that, if you would say that it didn't happen even though you know it really did and would do it just for the money, then you'll be bruised and spend the money alone." And so Philip Klass took that quotation and just completely removed the center part of it and put 3 little dots in the sentence. So he said, if you take the money, you'll be bruised. And so he was trying to, he actually said, it appears that Mike was trying to threaten Steve to keep him from recanting. And that's not at all what he said. He was threatening if he lied about the incident. And this $10,000 bribe, oh, by the way, Philip Klass mentioned that in his book. So he was implying and admitting that this $10,000 offer existed, because what else are we talking about here? So it was actually basically an admission of a $10,000 bribe to try to discredit the incident. Now, who has that kind of money? Not even a guy who is an editor at Aviation Week and Space Technology. I believe the evidence is pretty strong that this money was being bankrolled by some covert agency supplying him with the money. I got a hold of the FBI file on Klass. They were investigating him on a number of occasions in the matter of disclosing classified material. Through his job, he was getting a whole stuff. They were looking into, had he purchased any transmitting equipment so that he might radio other spies and that sort of thing. And the most damning bit of evidence in that Freedom of Information Act file was a memo from J. Edgar Hoover. And this memo was, got his name on it. Certain classified bits on every document that's released this way is blacked out, but J. Edgar Hoover sent a memo to the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, which at that time was so super secret that they didn't put his name on the memo, they just said Director CIA. Anyway, basically they were turning the investigation of Klass over to other agencies, and this is a classic CIA recruiting tactic. You get some legal matter you can hold over somebody's head, and then you have some degree of control over them.
Oh, sorry, we're trying to organise some water for you. Do you want a drink of water? Do you want to drink the water? My staff were so tempted, they forced the speakers to drink water. Thank you very much. You will drink. Okay. Now, as we obviously I've been privy to some conversations with you since you got over here, but there's an aspect that we touched on that I think is interesting, and I don't think many people will be aware of it. Now, is it right to say that your experience for many years haunted you, traumatized you, but in recent years you've now begun to look at it in a slightly different way?
Yeah, initially, the number one, never mind what skeptics were saying, I never heard of them before, I didn't know anything about that, I didn't care. I was dealing with the emotional impact of what I'd been through, the trauma of that in itself. I was hanging by a thread in those weeks and months right after it happened. And so that was my main priority, dealing with that. the news media actually said, and I've got a tape of it, it's in that Travis film, that the fact that I wasn't speaking to the media cast doubt on the story. And then, of course, once I began speaking to the media, that was suspicious because obviously you're seeking attention. So damned if I do and damned if I don't. But, you know, I did have to get out there and set the record straight.
Okay, now there's also a quote that I mentioned to you that I heard in doing some research for this interview, where you were attributed to have said, more or less, if the incident had happened again, I wouldn't have got out of the truck. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, yeah, you know, and it was partly some of the feedback I was getting from the other crew. All this crap wouldn't be happening to us if you hadn't got out of the truck and gone and done this, you know. So they were kind of blaming the blow up, the negative feedback that was coming on me. And of course, I had to face the fact that it was true. You know, if I hadn't got out of the truck, we wouldn't be going through all of that.
But in terms of how you psychologically dealt with it then and now, many 41 years later, I think you have a different perspective on on the experience as a whole,
Yeah.
i.e. negative to positive, that kind of thing.
Initially, you know, the experience itself, the horror, the shock, the threat, the feeling of utter terror just overshadowed every interpretation I had of it. And, you know, I just immediately accepted the term abduction, and all of this stuff that was going on was so painful. The whole thing was just totally negative to me. It took me decades to figure out that actually what might have been happening there was not designed to torment me, but was actually designed to rescue me from my own mistake of getting so close to that craft that I was injured by it, and which actually forced them to do something they never intended to do, was to take me aboard, and that was just to save my life. The nearest hospital was over an hour away. None of the crew knew CPR. And they said that when that energy hit me, it threw me through the air 15 or 20 feet. And they immediately were certain it had killed me. That they said they were just yelling at each other, he's dead, let's go, let's go, let's go. And that was the sensible thing to do under that circumstance. It was so violent that they knew it killed me. And when they saw it leave, they were already headed back. So it took a lot of courage on their part to get a grip on their fear, come back to see if they could rescue me. And Kenny said that the greatest fear he had was just what my body was going to look like. Was I charred? You know, Dwayne Smith and Steve had argued about whether I was even in one piece when I hit the ground. But John said that when I hit the ground, it was like a sack of meat. Like there wasn't a bone in my body. So that was part of what made him certain that it had killed me.
So do you, all these years later, 41 years later, do you think this is maybe not the horrific kind of thing that you thought for many, many years,
Yeah,
and that
so
there was maybe something else going on?
initially I was really concerned that there would be bad health effects, you know, and that was the concern my brother had. His immediate thing was, never mind the sheriff, we're getting this guy to a doctor. We can't do it here in town. This is a madhouse around here. It's just crazy. You know, people tromping through the flower beds, taking pictures through the windows, calling up, you know, constant phone calls and harassment. And so he took me off to Phoenix and got me checked out medically. Had a whole battery of tests, many of which undercut the theories that the skeptics came up with. But the main idea being to assure that there weren't going to be some really serious medical consequences to this. But as time went on, not only did that not materialize, I seemed to be having some rather good health. And I still didn't ever talk about that in the interviews until I could go in and get the printout of the records from my employers that showed that I never called in sick in 40 years. And so You know, I do try to live healthy, and you know, I don't have any bad health habits, and it could just be luck and good health practices and good genes or whatever. But it's also possible that in the process of reviving me, that there was a little beneficial side effect.
And just sort of continuing on that, you told me something that I found really surprising about the fact that this man is a sprinter, as in running fast. Are you happy to talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's just a hobby I have.
Tell the people.
I can still outrun my kids at half my age.
How old are you now?
I'm 63.
Okay, well, right, 63. But it's this anecdote about sprinting. You don't see many 63-year-olds who actively sprint. But tell me what you're planning to do, or what you're planning to enter.
Never mind that.
Can I say briefly?
No, let's move
All
on.
right, okay. All right. Now, you've been to England a few times in the past. How many times?
Yeah, I was here December before last. I was went a tour of various UFO related sites with Sean Ryder for the Discovery Channel. Sean Ryder on UFOs, and that was really interesting to meet a lot of those people and see those sites.
Okay. Now, in terms of where we are now, we talked about Fire in the Sky. You still get called by producers, don't you, about possibly a remake or a
Yeah,
more
I've been
true
contacted by
variation?
a number of filmmakers who, you know, say that, yeah, it's time to do a remake, and I agree. I've been collecting emails from people, and it's very helpful that they send me this kind of thing, saying they would like to see a more accurate remake of the film. And so eventually I'll put all those together in a single binder and take it to the studio, and at the time of my choosing, when the time is right. But, you know, I have been approached by, you know, filmmakers, because I never went to them, you know, about a remake.
Do you think it will happen?
Pardon?
Do you ever think it will really happen?
Oh yeah, I think it's inevitable it'll happen.
But I think you're going to insist on being script supervisor.
Yeah, and
it's
you know,
done right.
just have some kind of input about staying accurate with it. It'll happen.
Okay, well, I look forward to that. Now, we're coming to an end, but for me, it's been a great honour to have you meet you, and have this interview. Have you enjoyed this kind of background, little one-to-one? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And in a surprising twist, me being me, I would like to present you with an award. Because, my God, you give the man a courage in ufology. Courage in ufology.
This is one I can back all the way. It's my honor, brother.
41 years in the public eye, getting probably a lot of shit from a lot of people. This guy deserves yours. Walton, thank you very much. He's doing the lecture tomorrow. Thank you very much. And you fully deserve this award. As a magazine editor, it's quite good because I can get to do what I want. And so I kind of look at this subject, having followed it for 40 years, and I think certain things need to be addressed. And this guy has been around for 41 years, taking shit from people, but he's been treated better and better as the years have gone by, and we were talking about that your acceptance now is more and more. But 41 years of an abduction experience is a long time, so you fully deserve this award. So a final round of applause for Thomas.
Thank you. So much more to talk about, but you never got it.
Right, so we're into a... all right, do you want some photographs at the front? Yeah, come on, Travis, come on. Quickly, some photographs if you want photographs.